we're enormously grateful for everybody who's come along. Very eclectic audience tonight. We've got people from the Open University. We've got people from WS Society. We've got people from Brighton, which is, of course, where we run our in-person events. We have King's College people. We have people from the Old Edinburgh Club, from the Walter Scott Society. I hope I haven't missed anybody out. If you're just randomly coming because you fancied it, then that's great too. We will take anybody who's interested in the kind of odder end of historical study. Robert is already had a distinguished career in the law, as most of you know, but he has opened up a second line of attack. He is and has become a historian. And he began his history career at the Open University, which is why we have several Open University people here tonight. But he did his doctorate at King's College London, and it's an element of his doctoral thesis that he's going to be talking about this evening, with this particular talk about George IV. But he's obviously, has proved his chops, so to speak, as he's now a visiting fellow at the KCL as well. So as he becomes already garlanded, and we're very lucky to have him. I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to allow Robert to carry on. As I say, if you have any problems technically, then put them in the chat box. I'll try and sort them out, and we will have some Q&A at the end. But for the time being, it's over to Robert. Thank you very much for listening to my prattle on.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and good evening, everyone. I'm just going to put some slides up. My interest in George IV's 1822 visit to Scotland began when I was puzzled that the most read modern history of Scotland, Professor Tom Devine's The Scottish Nation, referred to the visit as a Highland Celtic fantasy in which, and I quote, the lowlands played no part. I was puzzled because the entire visit took place in the lowlands capital of Scotland and showcased Edinburgh's transformation from the 1750s onwards, from a cramped medieval citadel to a model Georgian British metropolis. I'm talking to you from my office in the Signet Library in Edinburgh's Parliament Square on the Royal Mile. The Signet Library was one of the largest public buildings of Edinburgh's mid-18th century, mid to early 19th century renewal. You can see from this image the neoclassical splendor and rationality of the architecture. Just over 200 years ago, George IV entered this very building for one of the set pieces of the royal visit. The Signet Library, as many of you know, is home to the Society of Writers to His Majesty's Signet, a writer to the signet being a Scottish lawyer, one of the oldest professional bodies in the world, and today a Scottish charity. The Society combines conserving and curating our historical collections and archive with being a modern professional body of lawyers. And I want to thank you for your donations for this event. On 24th August 1822, entering the upper hall of the Signet Library, George IV declared it the finest drawing room in Europe. And we remind people of that ever since. An early visitor was moved to describe the library as a cathedral of books, and looking behind me, you can probably see why. The King's visit to Edinburgh was the first by a reigning monarch of England and Scotland since Charles I in 1633. George IV was in the city for 2 weeks for a series of events, including a landing at Leith, an entry into Edinburgh, a grand procession, levees at the Royal Palace of Holyrood House, citywide illuminations, military review, grand ball, a service at St Giles Cathedral, and a grand banquet. Remarkably, the city authorities only had 3 weeks' notice of the biggest formal occasion in Edinburgh in living memory. As soon as it was announced, a great movement of people throughout Scotland began towards the capital. Numbers in Edinburgh were estimated at the time to be at least 300,000, more than double the city's normal population and 1/7 of the whole country. Celebrated artists travelled to Edinburgh to document the visit. Here is Turner's painting of the Grand Banquet in Parliament Hall, the Renaissance building that housed the Scottish Parliament before the 1707 union with England. Parliament Hall was subsequently incorporated behind the neoclassical facade of Scotland's Supreme Courts, and a door still connects the Signet Library straight into Parliament Hall to this day. So, as you will gather, the Royal Mile and Parliament Square played a central role in the visit. Historians consistently represent the visit as a ridiculous episode, and I'm going to dispute this, not to be contentious, but simply based on the evidence. I'm also going to question the account they give of George IV in Edinburgh as a sort of useful idiot in a Highland pageant stage managed by Sir Walter Scott. Evidence shows George IV was well informed on Scottish history and his family's royal Stuart ancestry, about which I will say more later. I will argue that the meaning and historical significance of the people's reaction are overlooked in accounts of the visit. And this trivializing of an important state occasion has been very helpful to those who wish to represent or taint Scottish identity as somehow fake or invented. One of the catchphrases about the visit, 1 and 20 daft days, gives the impression of credulous Scots kowtowing to a king known to be unpopular south of the border. And it's striking how strong the language used is and how historians enjoy talking about how tasteless everything was. George IV is frequently portrayed as dissolute, profligate, and disloyal to his wife. Simplistic characterizations of a complex man add to the sense of farce around the visit. But let's be clear, it wasn't just Scots who felt his visit to Edinburgh was a nationally significant spectacle worth witnessing. Look at the scene in Greenwich on the 10th of August 1822, as the king embarked on the royal yacht for Edinburgh. The panorama mirrors his arrival in Leith, only on a larger scale. Thousands of people lined the shore, and newspapers reported the streets from London to Greenwich thronged with people, and, quote, everything presented the appearance of some great festival. This context of a British phenomenon is lacking from accounts which focus exclusively on events in Edinburgh. You've heard the phrase, the King's Jaunt, and you've no doubt seen images like this caricature from the time. From 1822 onwards, a singular interpretation of the visit has dominated, from academic textbooks to tourist websites. It goes something like this. It was Walter Scott's invention. He made up the idea of Highland dress as national costume and persuaded the king to wear a kilt. Scotland's preeminent historian, Tom Devine, is typical in the book I've already referred to. Quote, a series of extraordinary pageants, all with a Highland flavour, were stage managed by Sir Walter Scott. Or the National Galleries of Scotland website, quote, his visit was largely stage managed by Sir Walter Scott. Scots from throughout the country were urged to come to Edinburgh dressed in tartan. So profoundly has this interpretation taken hold that when you Google Sir Walter Scott, the second people also asked result is, did Walter Scott invent Scotland? It's that bad. One book has been devoted to the visit, John Preble's 1988, The King's Jaunt, George IV in Scotland, 1 and 20 daft days. Preble died in 2001, yet remains a best-selling author of Scottish history. His other subjects, such as Culloden or the Highland clearances, have seen countless revisions. But for some reason, George IV's visit has not. The King's Jaunt interpretation dominates and is often the only source cited. Historians are aware of Preble's shortcomings. His lack of footnotes and citations makes it impossible to tell what's evidence, what's hearsay, and what's author's opinion. Yet there's been no re-examination of the visit. Preble's assessment was scathing, and I quote, "No other nation has cherished so absurd an image, and none perhaps would accept it while knowing it to be a lie. For that monstrous error, the pageantry of Scott and the euphoria of the King's Jaunt were largely responsible." In Scottish cultural history, Hugh Trevor Roper's The Invention of Scotland, Myth and History similarly casts a long shadow. Quote, "Scott transformed himself into an imaginary Highland chieftain. The charade of George IV's visit has an important place in the mythology of Highland dress." According to Trevor Roper, the royal visit was, I quote, "a farce. It was part of the national honour to maintain cultural myths. In Scotland, myth has played a far more important part in history than it has in England. The whole history of Scotland has been coloured by myth, and myth in Scotland is never driven out by reality." But is it really credible that one man, Walter Scott, organised everything? In Edinburgh City archives, there is no record of Scott being put in charge. Walter Scott was on 2 of the 4 committees responsible for the major set pieces of the occasion. And even Preble cites no actual evidence for Scott being appointed Master of Ceremonies. Ironically, those like Trevor Roper who assert the dominance of myth in Scottish history are themselves responsible for 4 myths about the visit. I call these the succession myth, the tartan myth, the Highland myth, and the daft myth. Together, they contribute to what I would call a meta-myth. If you'll bear with me here, I mean that they contribute to a myth about the dominance of myth in Scottish history. First of all, the succession myth. This is the idea that it was ridiculous to present George IV as King of Scots with royal Stuart ancestry, a supposed fiction always attributed to Walter Scott. Any mention of George IV's Scottish ancestry is met with derision by historians. Yet, the whole reason George IV was king was his Stuart ancestry. His Hanoverian and Protestant line of the Stuart royal dynasty were the lawful heirs to the throne of the United Kingdom. George I was the great-grandson of the Stuart James VI of Scotland and the great-great-grandson of Mary Queen of Scots. To understand the imaginative power of royal Stuart lineage, it represented an unbroken line back to Scotland's legendary medieval hero, Robert the Bruce. When popular history became a publishing phenomenon in the Enlightenment era, monarchy provided the narrative structure. This title page of a 1791 edition of William Robertson's History of Scotland emphasises the accession of Scotland's Stuart king, James VI, to the crown of England as James I. Modern histories are generally structured by decades, centuries, or themes. In the Georgian era, people learned national history through the succession of kings and queens. And it's extremely important in relation to the visit to remember, going back to the Declaration of Arbroath of 1320, a core constituent of Scottish identity was a distinctive relationship with monarchy. Hence, in 1822, a journalist and future editor of the Sunday Times newspaper wrote, "For monarchy, the Scots had a profound and unalterable veneration." Scotland's Stuarts were truly a European royal dynasty. Remember, Mary Queen of Scots was once Queen of France. Elizabeth Stuart was Queen of Bohemia and a European icon of Protestantism. Mary Stuart was Princess of Orange. A German line of Stuart royal blood acceding to the British throne was no accident. George IV is inaccurately spoken of as the first member of the Hanoverian royal family to show an enthusiasm for Stuart Scottish culture. We're all familiar with paintings of Bonnie Prince Charlie and tartan, and that's one reason why many people associate tartan with the Jacobite Stuarts and assert that before 1822 it was antithetical to the Hanoverian dynasty. But certain Hanoverians wanted to project a Hanoverian Stuart identity. Here is a detail from a 1746 portrait depicting the family of Frederick, Prince of Wales, a painting which hung in the royal family's apartments and was marketed in prints to the public. Who do you think is the figure in tartan? It's the future King George III, aged 8. George wears the tartan uniform and blue bonnet, the St Andrew's Cross of the Royal Company of Archers, given a royal charter by the Stuart Queen Anne. And of course, 1746, the year of this painting, was also the year of Culloden, when George's uncle, the Duke of Cumberland, was defeating a tartan-clad Jacobite army in the Highlands. Frederick chose to present his heir in a Stuart tartan. The man who supposedly came up with this idea, Walter Scott, isn't even born for another 25 years. When Frederick died in 1751 without ever becoming king, the dominant male influence on Prince George became the Scot, John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute. Evidence from, among other things, George III's teenage essays in the Royal Archives at Windsor show how this relationship had made George very aware of his Scottish and Stuart royal ancestry. Next, I come to the tartan myth. The tartan myth asserts that the visit blanketed Edinburgh in tartan, with which its citizens and George IV were allegedly hitherto unfamiliar. Histories of the visit remind readers that tartan was banned in 1747, but tend to overlook that the ban was lifted by George III in 1782. And even during the ban, visual evidence shows that tartan being worn in Edinburgh, and not just by soldiers who were exempt. In his 2001 bestseller, The Scottish Enlightenment, Arthur Herman epitomizes the tartan myth. Quote, "Most Edinburghers had no idea what real Highlanders looked like. This is simply nonsense. There is overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and I'll give you just a few examples. One is this David Allen's 1780 work entitled A Group of Edinburgh Characters, and it shows a Highland soldier in the foreground, and out to the left, a Highland drover in the background. They're both wearing kilts. And it's not surprising that Allen would see such a drover, as they were a seasonal and itinerant workforce. Low-status Highlanders were also permanent residents in the city, enjoying a monopoly of the sedan chair business, the Uber of its day. And they were dominant among the city's grooms and caddies. Here in 1755, just 9 years after Culloden, is a print from a contemporary journal showing the Governor-in-Chief of His Majesty's forces in North America. This is the 4th Earl of Loudoun, and he wears full Highland dress uniform as a commander of a Highland regiment, although himself a lowlander from south of Glasgow. It's an image evidencing that in the 1750s, there were regiments of loyal Hanoverian soldiers following a tartan-clad commander. If I told you that this print was of Bonnie Prince Charlie, you might actually believe me. Here is one of my favourite Edinburgh characters of the era, shown in this 1759 portrait of John Campbell, or as he was known, John of the Bank Campbell, Edinburgh resident and most senior employee of the Royal Bank of Scotland, established in 1727 by Royal Charter. The Royal Bank was all about Hanoverian monarchy. They were the first bank in the world to feature a face on their notes, that of King George II. And one of these distinctive notes is visible on the table beside Campbell. I've referred to the ban on Highland dress and weaponry at this time, yet here in 1759 is an Edinburgh banker and lawyer choosing to be portrayed as a proud Highlander in all the gear. He's fully tooled up with basket hill sword, dirk, targe, and pistol. And I wouldn't be surprised if he had another pistol inside that jacket. Not your image of a cautious Edinburgh banker. In fact, if he appeared in a Walter Scott novel, people would say the author had got carried away with Highland fantasies. Campbell's portrait is a powerful reminder to be wary of simplistic categorization of people as either Highland or lowland, rural or urban, and a reminder that the ban was very selectively enforced. So this is just some evidence as to why I say it's nonsense to suggest that no one in Edinburgh had seen a kilt before 1822. George IV and his brothers collected Highland clothing, accoutrements and weaponry, including Bonnie Prince Charlie's sword captured at Culloden. George IV's younger brother, Prince Augustus, Duke of Sussex, is seen here around 1805 as commander of the Loyal North British Volunteers Militia Corps, who paraded in kilts at the famous Volunteer Review in Hyde Park before George III on 28 October 1803. Augustus was also president of the Highland Society of London from 1806 to 1809. A Hanoverian in a kilt is often attributed to Scots romanticism, yet here is a member of the royal dynasty in tartan, 8 years before Walter Scott's first historical novel was published, Waverley, in 1814. This image capitalized not on Scott's romantic fiction, but on the real reputation of real Highland regiments in warfare. In high society, Highland balls became fashionable in London from the 1780s onwards, led by a notable Scot in the royal circle, Jane, Duchess of Gordon, who, as you can see from these two examples, was ruthlessly satirized. Members of the royal family were frequent participants at balls. Newspapers reported in 1789 the Prince of Wales, later George IV, and brothers Frederick and William, who was later William IV, attending a Highland ball in London, where they wore tartan Highland dress and danced Highland reels. History suggests it was through Walter Scott's so-called pageants of 1822 that tartan came to represent all Scots and not just Highlanders. In fact, it had been happening from the 1740s onwards, when English satirists began using tartan to signify all Scots. The volume of printed material expressing anti-Scottish feeling, or Scotophobia, in the later half of the 18th century was truly vast, and Scots were always depicted in Highland dress. This caricature is entitled A Flight of Scotchmen, not A Flight of Highlanders. All Scots are shown kilted, descending like a horde on London. Tartan dress as a national signifier existed well before Walter Scott. A frequent criticism of the visit is that lowlanders suddenly adopted Highland dress. This is both an exaggeration and an oversimplification. Take the example of John Grant, a writer to the Signet, who wore Highland dress for the first time. Grant had moved to Edinburgh aged 10, but was descended from generations of Highlanders. His mother recalled he wore the kilt, quote, very reluctantly, having a great dislike to exhibitions of himself, and he feared teasing from his fellow lawyers. But, his mother added, he soon reconciled to the garb of his ancestors. Preble presents Grant as an Edinburgher indulging himself in Celtified fakery. Is it not equally likely that Grant found a royal occasion a fitting setting in which to embrace his very real heritage? You might say that John of the Bank and John Grant and all the others were simply owning it, showing pride in national dress others had derided. Next, I come to the Highland myth. The Highland myth is the idea that the Highlands were the dominant and overrepresented cultural image in evidence during the visit. Among the prominent people at the time who suggested the Highlands were overrepresented was Scott's son-in-law and biographer John Gibson Lockhart, the most quoted primary source on the visit, responsible for so many of the disparaging epithets repeated by others ever since. Lockhart asserted that Highlanders, quote, had always constituted a small and almost always an unimportant part of the Scottish population. This was a bizarre assertion when in 1755 half the Scottish population lived in the Highlands, and even by 1862 Highlanders accounted for 30%. This is just one example where a tendentious Lockhart opinion has been treated as factual, yet no one has questioned the reliability of any part of Lockhart's critical account of the royal visit. This 1780 painting shows a Highland wedding in Perthshire. The clearances and other socio-economic changes drove many people from the Highlands to the lowland cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. Evidence shows Highlanders retained and mixed this culture through family bonds, music, language, and dress, whilst assimilating into lowland urban environments. This dynamic is evidenced by my research into admission to this very institution, the Society of Writers to His Majesty's Signet, in the period from 1746 to George IV's death in 1830. For those of you who don't know, the signet is the royal seal used to authenticate Scottish Supreme Court papers to this day, and hence being a writer to the signet has always been highly prestigious because of that royal connection. It would be easy to think of the writers to the signet, headquartered here in Edinburgh, were dominated by lowlanders. Yet my research showed that over 30% of those joining the society between 1746 and 1830 had a Highland connection, either through birth, family, or marriage. Of the three soberly dressed writers to the signet in this 1784 John Kay print, two were Highlanders. Colquhoun Grant, on the right, had been a Jacobite and a member of Bonnie Prince Charlie's bodyguards. He evaded capture after Culloden and resurfaced to become a writer to His Majesty's Signet on the 29th of June, 1759. Interesting when you consider how staunchly Hanoverian the society was. Indeed, in the immediate aftermath of Culloden in 1746, the society wasted no time in expressing allegiance, sending loyal addresses and commissioning new robes and ordering a new mace to welcome the victorious Duke of Cumberland, son of George II. Colquhoun Grant's history was well known within the society, and it shows that even outwardly staunch Hanoverian institutions could reconcile with former Jacobites. And the novelist Walter Scott wasn't around to invent that idea. The assertion by the leading Scottish historian Tom Devine that the Lowlands had no part is astonishing. Lowland regiments and lowland institutions, national institutions headquartered in Edinburgh, like the Church of Scotland and the College of Justice, the built environment and topography of Edinburgh as the stage for processions, parades, and illuminations, all were vital components of the visit. Edinburgh's Newtown urban development was a monumental statement of modernity, explicitly associated with the Hanoverian dynasty through the naming of its streets. George IV declared Edinburgh a city of palaces. Here is the vista along Queen Street as the king processed into the city. And of course, historically, the capital city had the potent associations of having hosted a royal court and previous royal processions with their spectacle and symbolism. As the Lord Provost declared to the king in 1822, "The citizens of Edinburgh have never forgotten their ancient ties of intimate communication betwixt your Majesty's royal ancestors and the former inhabitants of this city." Finally, I come to the daft myth. Here is a representative quote. Most historians and writers poke fun at the royal visit, and for good reason, with its falsification of Scottish history and exaggerated ridiculousness. It was a jaded aristocrat, John Murray, the 4th Duke of Atholl, who first called the visit 1 in 20 daft days. And elite male opinions, like his, have dominated. A cross-section of eyewitnesses from diverse backgrounds, ages and genders should be given equal weight. Written evidence from young women, such as the Grant sisters of Rothiemurchus, does not convey that they found everything daft. Often they record being moved or awestruck. The daft myth also ignores historical context, precedent, and expected forms and behaviours on a royal occasion in the era, and overlooks the solemn, meaningful elements whilst ridiculing the showiest. This trivialises the reaction of the people of Scotland and their shared history with monarchy. Observe top left the detail from Eubank's famous painting of George IV's procession into Edinburgh. The orderly crowd are shown dressed as advised by the magistrates of Edinburgh, and the anonymous hints pamphlet, which was authored, of course, by Walter Scott. It's a complete myth that Scott told people to come wearing tartan. He advised men to wear blue jackets, white waistcoats, and white trousers. Women, he actually advised to avoid tartan dresses. Yet, the painting depicts what we're told were daft days of a plaided panorama. When I viewed this painting in the City Art Centre in Edinburgh, an intern present proceeded to tell me this is when tartan was invented and became the national dress. Ironic when none appeared in the painting before us. Here is George IV in his coronation robes, his coronation having taken place just 13 months before the visit to Edinburgh. Bear in mind, Georgian society was all about displays of wealth and status. This was not a less is more era, this was a more is more era. George IV's lavish coronation involved historical Stuart and Tudor dress, and medieval tropes, including a knight in full armour on horseback. George IV himself was determined it would outdo Napoleon's coronation, and used as a precedent the coronation of the Stuart, King James VII. In 1821, George IV visited Ireland, and the format followed a pattern similar to Edinburgh's a year later. Parades, balls, poems, commemorative medals, and so on. There was equivalent advice in Dublin on dress, behaviour, and projecting the right national image. Triumphal arches, processions, crown jewels, religious services, elaborate costumes, these were tropes common to royal occasions throughout Europe. Edinburgh was not exceptional or daft. The service at St Giles Cathedral, depicted here, was marked by great solemnity. Witnesses recorded how quiet Edinburgh streets were. It wasn't daft. It was regarded as historic, affirming the position of the king in Scotland as head of state, but not head of the established church, as he was in England. Jane Grant wrote, "The king goes in state to the high church today, which will do more than any other thing to make him popular. She says this about a religious service, not about the king wearing a kilt. Like monarchy, the church was a pillar of Scottish identity from the earliest times, acquiring more national character with the Reformation. Prayers for the royal family were said at weekly services and on special occasions, such as during George III's illnesses, and also on the outbreak of war. The church's moderator and George IV are both shown here, positioned in a kind of canopied face-off above the congregation. But only the moderator is speaking. 2 or 3 figures wear tartan, which appears accurate of the visit in general, that tartan was an element in proceedings, but not a dominant one. The citywide illuminations were described by witnesses as one of the most memorable events of the visit. All private homes and businesses participated, displaying transparencies with messages such as "Welcome to the land of your ancestors." Even the radical-leaning Scotsman newspaper joined in, and the immaculate behaviour of the large crowds of the common people was praised everywhere. George IV's private tour of the apartments of Mary Queen of Scots at Holyrood House was another solemn occasion. He was anxious nothing be done to alter or modernise them. The king dressed modestly and arrived without ostentation, spending an hour slowly looking around and touching the bed and blankets where Mary had slept. This is evidence of a more thoughtful and private king than popular histories tend to report. It suggests his interest, his reverence even, in regard to his Stuart ancestor and 7 times great-grandmother. The king attended the theatre for a performance of an adaptation of Scott's Rob Roy as his final appearance in Edinburgh. Historians dwell on this, and it conveniently chimes with their assertions of Scott having stage-managed the entire visit. The theatre notice shows it's the king who gets top billing. In theatres, all different classes mixed, and the occasion demonstrated George IV's ability to adapt his behaviour, joining the singing and laughing heartily at the comedy. Historians present this as George's buffoonery and give him no credit on other occasions for sitting through interminable addresses and repetitive ceremonies without offending anyone. So those are the 4 historians' myths about the visit. And I want to conclude with some remarks about the 2 figures who dominate accounts, Walter Scott and George IV. Indeed, in many respects, Walter Scott has virtually displaced the king as apparently the main player in accounts of the visit. And that I think this is completely inaccurate. Almost immediately after the visit, carping about Scott's role grew and has dominated ever since. Some came from his usual critics, some from those who hadn't witnessed events but eagerly believed stories of Scott's supposed obsequiousness to royalty and invented pageantry. Scott was a lawyer, a judge, and a historian. From 1806, he was principal clerk in Scotland's Supreme Civil Court. Facts and precedent were important to him. In totality, his fiction is not dominated by romantic Highlanders. One of his greatest novels, The Heart of Midlothian, is set in Edinburgh in 1736. It was groundbreaking. Its heroine was a young peasant girl, and the plot revolved around illegitimacy and infanticide. In the world Scott portrayed, monarchy was everything. It was to Hanoverian monarchy that the heroine, Jeanie Deans, looked for mercy. Jeanie makes an epic journey on foot from Edinburgh to London, where, in the grounds of Richmond Palace, as shown in this 19th century print, she pleads with the Queen for a reprieve for her sister, who has been condemned to die for infanticide. You might say that this is just a piece of Walter Scott fantasy, that a novel doesn't evidence anything. But The Heart of Midlothian is based on true events. In 1738, a young woman, Helen Walker, did indeed walk from lowland Scotland to London and successfully sought a royal pardon for her sister, condemned to death for child murder. Scott paid for a memorial to Helen Walker bearing this inscription: "This humble individual practiced in real life the virtues with which fiction invested the imaginary character of Jeannie Deans." Whatever part Scott played in whatever part he played in the 1822 visit was rooted in this kind of historical integrity, the same integrity that underpins the heart of Midlothian. The Hanoverian Scotland he is said to have invented already existed. We should ask ourselves, would the set pieces of the visit have been any different had Walter Scott not been involved? I suggest the answer is not much. Daily in Edinburgh, the young Walter Scott would have witnessed scenes like this one, shown in this 1784 print of Judge Lord Gardenstone and his Highland groom. Gardenstone, looking every inch the lowland judge, was in fact a Highlander. Such a scene would have appealed to Scott, and this is just the point. Scott observed such scenes and people. He didn't invent them. This was the Edinburgh and Scotland of his time, a world in which lowland and Highland peoples and cultures were blending. I believe Scott's role has been grossly misrepresented as invention. Certainly he wrote to the Highland chiefs, and approximately 300 clansmen came to Edinburgh in Highland garb. In what sense was this invention? Scott was only following the precedent of Charles I's 1633 visit, when the chieftains were ordered to the city to show loyalty to the king. Besides, among 300,000 people in Edinburgh, the clansmen would have been a very small minority, albeit a conspicuous one. I have not shown the most ubiquitous image of the visit, the old favourite, David Wilkie's full-length portrait of George IV in Highland dress, and I'm not going to show you it. Only completed 2 months before George IV's death in 1830, nobody in Scotland saw it for many decades. What they did see by 1831 was the statue of George IV, paid for by public subscription, erected at the crossing of George Street and Hanover Street. The statue depicts George IV in fashionable gentleman's clothes, in a long cloak carrying the sceptre. This is how the king was memorialized in the city, not in a kilt. Wilkie made this tiny pen and ink sketch at the time in 1822 of the one occasion when the king wore tartan. This is therefore a more immediate, true-to-life image. Every history mentions the king's outfit, his Highland outfit, often as an example of his extravagant self-indulgence. However, the 60-year-old king must have anticipated merciless ridicule in print, given that he was observed to look down at his kilt and say, "I cannot help smiling at myself." It does seem likely he was uncomfortable wearing it, since he only did so once in Edinburgh, at an invitation-only private levee. Had the visit depended upon tartan for success, the king only wearing it once in private would have been a problem. Yet historians are remorseless about the pink tights that the king wore to cover lesions on his legs. As if he was an eyewitness and not a modern historian, Herman describes the king's, quote, bloated red face, his enormous belly hanging over his kilt, and tights stretched skin tight around his bulging, flabby thighs. For large-scale public occasions, the king wore a field marshal's uniform, as shown here. Disembarking from Leith and processing into the city, he wore the naval equivalent, an admiral's uniform. He is shown here in that uniform, receiving the honours of Scotland, the Scottish Crown Jewels. It seems obvious that the hundreds of thousands cheering the king's arrival were cheering because he was, quite simply, the king. For the first time in 200 years, a monarch who only existed in the imagination was present in Scotland. He wasn't cheered for his kilt because he wasn't seen wearing one. George IV behaved as the Scottish people expected of their king. He greeted the crowds. He admired the city. He listened to loyal addresses. He attended church. He climbed onto the battlements of Edinburgh Castle to greet the crowds for 15 minutes in the pouring rain. He joined in the toasts at the banquet, and he laughed and sang along with the audience in the theatre. This was not the behaviour of a buffoon. George IV should be given credit for meeting the expectations of him on each occasion. That he wore the kilt on one private occasion was a gift for caricaturists, but he was never seen in that by the public. Instead of seeing someone in a kilt, the people were finally seeing the king, for whom, when he was heir to the throne, they had prayed weekly every Sunday since his birth in 1762, for whose recovery from illness they had given thanks in church as recently as 1820, and for whose royal family they had prayed literally every Sunday. This was the son of the longest reigning king in British history, in whose army the people's grandfathers, fathers, brothers, sons, and grandsons had served in a series of global wars. The formality of a Georgian state occasion is easy to make fun of 200 years later. Treated in isolation as 1 in 20 daft days, the 1822 visit has been used to undermine an evolving and dynamic Scottish identity. George IV's visit is presented as producing a confected, fake Sir Walter Scottish identity. In fact, the visit as a whole evidenced, enacted even, the emergence over time of a resolved Scottish identity, affirmed through the king's presence. The visit consolidated that identity. It did not create it. If people did not recognise this Hanoverian Scottish identity, they wouldn't have accepted it. They wouldn't have cheered. If there's one thing that we know about Georgian crowds, they were quick to boo and hiss disapproval. It's simply ahistorical, bad history, to say that the success of the visit was down to one novelist's invention. The visit shows the power of monarchy in 1822 to act on the imagination of a community. A monarch in 1822, however flawed, was a focus of national identity. Even dissenting voices at the time recognised the sheer scale of the people's enthusiasm. The evidence shows it was the reaction of the people of Scotland, the people who lined the streets, crowded onto Calton Hill, waited outside Edinburgh Castle in the pouring rain. It was those people that made the visit the historical phenomenon that it was. Thank you for listening, and I will close my talk at that point.
Thank you. Oops, where am I? Oh, here I am. Thank you so much, Robert. That was absolutely magnificent. Absolutely fascinating. And I hope everybody else enjoyed it. It was truly a rich piece of history, and also what we really like as historians is when you actually kind of attack a kind of a consensus that is crystallized around something that turns out to have a very slim evidence base, and provide a more plausible interpretation.